The night of March 4th, 2022, started the same way it always did: a husband, a wife, a home near Park City, Utah. Kouri handed Eric a Moscow Mule. He drank it, and he never woke up. But here's what no one tells you right away: by the time investigators started pulling on that thread, what unraveled wasn't just a tragedy. It was a plan. A life insurance policy taken out just weeks before. A Valentine's Day when prosecutors say she tried to poison him the first time, and it didn't work. A housekeeper she allegedly turned to as a supplier. A secret lover she was texting that same morning. And then just weeks after burying her husband, Kouri Richins sat in front of a camera, calm and collected, promoting a children's book she wrote about grief. A book about helping children cope with the loss of a loved one. The book was called Are You With Me? The question is, was it ever really about grief? Or was it about something else entirely? Because when investigators finally got the toxicology report back, what they found in Eric Richins' system wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. Prosecutors say the level of fentanyl in his body was unquestionably lethal, and it came from the drink his wife placed in his hands. Stay with me, because this story goes deeper than you think. Before we get into the story, just pause for a second and think about what it would take, what kind of mind it would require to watch your husband stop breathing in the bed next to you, to call 911 and tell the dispatcher you found him cold to the touch, to sit across from detectives and answer their questions, and then, 1 year later, to walk into a television studio and promote a children's book you wrote about missing him. That is what Kouri Richins did. This is her story. All of it. From the beginning. Welcome to Raw True Crime. Today's case, Kouri Richins. Everything you need to know about the Eric Richins case. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a case. And drop a comment below. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing you all out there. Now let's get into it. She was born Kouri Darden on April 20th, 1990, in Oklahoma. And from the very first years of her life, the word that defined everything around her was instability. By the time Kouri was a grown woman sitting in a courtroom defending herself against a murder charge, prosecutors would put a document in front of the jury, a life story she had written herself, in the third person, at a wellness retreat in Arizona in 2021. And in that document, she laid out, in her own words, what it felt like to grow up the way she did. She moved 17 times. 17 different homes across 17 different states, dragged from place to place because of her parents' work and the chaos that followed the family wherever they went. Think about what that does to a child. No roots, no permanent friends, no sense that any address you sleep at tonight will be the same one you wake up at next year. 17 moves before she was old enough to make a single real choice about her own life. Her father was, by her own description, a successful engineer. She held on to that detail, the way children of troubled parents always hold on to the one good thing they can say about them. He was successful. He was smart. He was an engineer. But when Kouri was 6 years old, her father got behind the wheel of a vehicle while drunk, passed out, and struck a police officer who was conducting a traffic stop. He went to prison. And just like that, the engineer was gone, and the 6-year-old girl was left with a new kind of chaos to navigate. Her mother, Lisa Darden, became the center of Kouri's world after that, for better and for worse. Kouri would later describe her mother as her best friend, the person she talked to every single day. But Lisa Darden had her own struggles that carved themselves into their life together. Gambling. The kind that doesn't stop at the casino entrance when the money runs out. Kouri later recalled spending weekends in casino hotel rooms, watching her mother lose not just cash, but houses, cars, the basic material scaffolding of a family's life across a felt table. What does a child learn in that environment? She learns that security is an illusion. She learns that the floor can drop out from under you at any moment. She learns to want desperately, urgently, something that feels permanent, something that cannot be gambled away or taken by a prison sentence. A home. A family. A name that means something. By around the year 2000, Kouri and her mother and her brother Ronnie Darden settled in Utah. She was roughly 10 years old, and for the first time in her life, the moving stopped. She grew up in Utah. She went to school there. She got older, and eventually, she found her way to college, which she would later describe as a fresh start. A clean page. A place where nobody knew about the 17 moves, or the casino hotel rooms, or the father who hit a cop with his car. In college, She could be whoever she decided to be. And in 2009, she met a man named Kouri Richins. By her own account, it was immediate. She fell for the idea of him as much as the man himself, the idea of a marriage, of children, of a happy and stable family, the kind she had spent her entire childhood watching other people have. He came from a world she had never known. A ranch family, a father who was present, a faith community, roots so deep they had been growing in Utah soil for generations. She got pregnant during her sophomore year of college, and rather than slow down, she pressed forward toward the life she had always wanted, building it as fast as she could, the way people who grew up without something tend to do when they finally get close to it. What nobody could have known then, not Eric, not his family, maybe not even Kouri herself, was that underneath all that desire for stability lived something else. Something that had also been shaped by those 17 moves and those casino hotel rooms and the father who disappeared. A belief, buried deep, that the rules other people followed did not necessarily apply to her. That when something stood between her and what she wanted, there was always another way around it. That other way, it turned out, would cost a man his life. To understand what was lost on the morning of March 4th, 2022, you have to understand who Kouri Richins was. Not the version of Eric that the defense would later try to construct in a courtroom, the man they would paint as a secret drug addict, a man with hidden dependencies, a man whose death might have been his own doing. You have to understand the real Eric, the one his father testified about, the one his business partner knew, the one his sons will carry with them for the rest of their lives. Kouri Eugene Richins was born in 1982 in Bountiful, Utah. He was the eldest child of the Richins family, and being the eldest in that family meant something. His father, Eugene Richins, raised his children with a clear set of values: education, hard work, faith, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't waver when things get difficult. Eric absorbed all of it. He was raised in the tradition of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and like many young men in that faith, he chose to serve a 2-year mission as a young adult. His mission took him to Mexico City, a long way from the Utah ranches where he had grown up, but he went, and he served, and he came back with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being tested by something larger than yourself. Before the mission and the marriage and the business ventures, there was a boy who spent his time on a ranch learning what work actually meant. He hauled hay. He fed animals. He mended fences alongside his father. He learned that things worth having required physical effort and patience. No obstacle was too great. That was how his family and his friends described his approach to life. He simply looked at every challenge as something to be solved, not avoided. When he came back from his mission and built his life in Utah, he carried all of that with him. He started a business. He built something from the ground up. He was, by every account from the people who worked alongside him and lived near him, a man of enormous energy and generosity. His business partner, Kouri Richins, would later testify in court about the kind of man Eric was, not because he was required to construct a portrait, but because the portrait was simply true. And then there were his sons, Carter, Ashton, Weston. Kouri Richins coached their soccer teams. He coached their basketball teams. He coached their baseball teams. He was the kind of father who did not watch from the sidelines. He got on the field. He got in the gym. He was present in the way that is genuinely rare, the way that children remember for the rest of their lives, even when the memories of specific days begin to blur. He taught them to hunt. He took them into the outdoors. He showed them, by example, what it looked like to be a man who showed up. His own obituary, written by people who knew him best, described him as a family man who always strove to be the absolute best father and husband he could be, a man who did absolutely everything in his power to provide his family with every possible opportunity. Words like that appear in obituaries all the time, offered by people who feel obligated to say something kind. But the witnesses who later sat in a courtroom and talked about Kouri Richins were not obligated to be kind. They just were. Because he had been. Eric and Kouri were married on June 15, 2013, in a backyard ceremony in Utah. By then, they already had their first child together. Carter had arrived earlier, the product of Kouri's college pregnancy. So when they stood together and made their vows, they were already a family. They were just making it official. But they signed something else that day too. A prenuptial agreement. Eric was a man with assets of business, property, financial interests worth protecting. The agreement was clear. If Kouri ever left the marriage, she would leave with essentially nothing. Eric's money and property would remain his. She had come into the marriage building herself from scratch, and the prenup reflected that reality. There was, however, one exception built into that agreement. A single clause that would, years later, become the cornerstone of a murder prosecution. If Eric died while the two of them were still legally married, she inherited everything. Eric updated his will and his trust over the years, taking care to name his sister as trustee to protect the children's financial interests. He was a thorough man, a careful man. He thought about the future. He thought about his sons. He just never thought he needed to protect himself from his wife. For several years, the marriage looked the way Kouri had always wanted it to look. There was a house. There were children. There was a community, a church, a business, a life with the kind of visible shape and structure she had never had growing up. From the outside, the Richins family was a success story. But somewhere around 2018, things began to move in a direction that would eventually lead to catastrophe. Kouri discovered, or believed she had discovered, that her husband was having an emotional affair. Whatever the truth of that accusation, and it was never fully adjudicated, the effect it had on her was significant. She went to counseling. She described feeling emotionally exhausted by the marriage. She said her husband drained her, that the relationship had become a weight she didn't know how to carry. Whether this was genuine pain or a narrative she began constructing to justify what she was already considering, nobody can say for certain. What is clear is that around this same time, Kouri made two decisions that would define the next several years. The first decision was practical. In 2019, she started her own real estate business, Kouri Richins Realty LLC, built around buying houses, renovating them, and selling them for profit, what people call house flipping. She poured herself into it. She projected the image of a successful entrepreneur. She talked about deals and properties and closings. She carried herself like a woman building something. What she was actually building was a whole. The business was, from a financial standpoint, a slow-motion disaster. Prosecutors would later put a forensic accountant named Brooke Carrington on the stand, and Carrington's testimony was stark. Kouri's net worth on the day after her husband's death, the morning of March 5, 2022, was negative $1.6 million. The business was imploding. She owed lenders more than $1.8 million. The deals she was making were not profitable. The empire she described to friends and family simply did not exist in the numbers. The second decision was personal. She began an affair. His name was Robert Josh Grossman. She had first encountered him in South Carolina, where he answered a help-wanted advertisement she posted for a house-flipping project. He was a handyman, a veteran who had served in Iraq, a physically capable and unassuming man who could do the kind of work Kouri needed done on her properties. They communicated on and off. The connection grew slowly. Then, around 2020, he moved to Utah. Officially, he moved to continue helping her flip houses. But by the time he arrived in Utah, something had shifted between them. The relationship had turned romantic just before his move, and once he was in the same state, it became something more. He was employed by her. He worked on her properties. And he was also, in secret, her boyfriend. For Kouri, the affair appears to have opened up a kind of emotional escape valve. Here was a man who was not her husband. A man who had not seen her fail. A man with whom she could imagine a different life, a better life, an easier life. A life without the weight of the prenuptial agreement and the debt and the marriage that she had decided was suffocating her. She started putting those fantasies into text messages. In those texts, which would later be displayed on courtroom screens for a jury in Park City, Utah, Kouri wrote about wanting Eric to just go away, that if he would just disappear, life would be so perfect. She wrote about wanting to divorce Eric and take millions from the split. She wrote to Grossman about what it would look like if the two of them could be together without obstacles. And Grossman, for his part, responded to many of these messages. He was present in the fantasy. He didn't know, as far as anyone can prove, what Kouri was actually planning. But he was there, in those text threads, in the role she had written for him. In December of 2021, just 3 months before Eric Richins died, Kouri told a friend that she could not see an easy way forward out of her marriage. Not that she was working on it. Not that things were improving. She could not see a way forward. She had arrived, in her own mind, at a kind of dead end. And when the kind of person Kouri Richins appears to be arrives at a dead end, they don't turn around. They look for another exit. What happened in January and February of 2022 tells you everything you need to know about how deliberate this all was. Because nothing that happened in those weeks was impulsive. None of it was the result of a sudden argument or a moment of rage or a decision made in the heat of an unbearable instant. What Kouri Richins did in those weeks was methodical. It was planned. And it was put into motion before the first crime was even attempted. The sequence begins with life insurance. In late January of 2022, Kouri signed an application for a life insurance policy naming Eric Richins as the insured. The policy went into effect on February 4th, 2022. That date matters. Hold on to it. And the application itself was revealing. It contained errors. Among them, an incorrect social security number for Eric. An insurance agent would later testify that the application had been submitted with fraudulent information that the man whose life was being insured had not knowingly signed off on it. Kouri had forged his signature. She had submitted documentation in his name that he had no knowledge of. This was not the only policy. By the time Eric Richins died, his life was insured for more than $2.2 million across several different policies. Some of those policies Kouri had taken out years earlier, without his knowledge. Taken together, they represented a substantial sum enough to eliminate most of the debt, enough to give Kouri a genuine financial reset, enough to fund the kind of life she had been telling Grossman she wanted. The forensic accountant Brooke Carrington also testified that Kouri had forged Eric's signature on bank loan papers documents related to the real estate business that was quietly hemorrhaging money while presenting a public face of success. By the time of his death, Kouri's total debt exposure was estimated at $4.5 million. The life insurance would not cover all of it, but it would cover enough. And she was also entitled to inherit Eric's estate under the terms of the prenuptial agreement because, crucially, she had not left him. She was still his wife. There is one more piece of evidence from this period that deserves attention. In 2021, the year before the murder, Kouri attended a wellness retreat in Arizona. At that retreat, she completed a personal writing assignment. A self-authored life story, written in the third person, documenting her childhood, her marriage, her emotional state, and her sense of being trapped. It was the kind of exercise that wellness retreats use to help people process and reflect. Prosecutors showed it to the jury. In it, Kouri described a woman at the end of her rope. A woman who had tried everything and found herself with no way out. A woman who felt that her marriage had become a prison. She wrote about these things in 2021, a year before Eric's death, in a document she probably never imagined would one day be entered into evidence at her own murder trial. What the document shows is not just unhappiness. Unhappiness alone does not make a murderer. What it shows is the state of mind of a woman who was, by her own written account, already constructing a narrative in which she was the victim of her marriage, a narrative that could, in certain hands and under certain circumstances, be used to justify almost anything. The insurance policies were in place by February 4th, 2022. 10 days later, she made her first attempt on Eric's life. Before you can understand the Valentine's Day attempt, or the night of March 3rd, you have to understand how Kouri Richins got her hands on fentanyl. Because fentanyl is not something you pick up at a pharmacy without a prescription, and Eric Richins had no prescription for it. Nobody in that household did, at least not for fentanyl specifically. What the prosecution argued, and what the jury ultimately accepted, is that Kouri acquired the drug through a chain of people connected to her domestic life. Carmen Lauber was the Richins family housekeeper. She cleaned their home. She was, in the way of housekeepers who work for families over extended periods, a familiar presence, someone who knew the rhythms of the household, who understood the dynamics, who had a relationship with the woman of the house built on proximity and familiarity. Lauber was also, during this period, involved in the drug world in ways that would eventually bring significant consequences down on her own head. And according to her testimony, Kouri Richins knew it. Days before Valentine's Day 2022, Kouri approached Lauber and asked for something stronger than what Lauber had previously provided. When Lauber told her she could get fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that is, in its illicit form, extraordinarily potent and extraordinarily dangerous, Kouri told her to go ahead and get it. Lauber went to a drug dealer she knew named Robert Crozier. She acquired approximately 20 pills and brought them to Richins. Kouri paid her $1,000 in cash. Later, according to Lauber's testimony, Richins asked for more pills a third order, paid for with another $1,000. In total, Lauber testified, she had sold Richins up to 90 blue-green fentanyl pills across these transactions. In the courtroom, prosecutors used language that made the nature of the request vivid. Kouri Richins, they said, had asked specifically for what she called the Michael Jackson drug. The reference was to the famous overdose death of the pop star, who died from a powerful sedative administered in excessive quantities. Kouri Richins did not know the specific pharmacology of what she was asking for, but she knew that Michael Jackson had died from something extremely powerful, and she wanted whatever that was. The defense, of course, attacked this narrative aggressively. Robert Crozier himself took the stand and testified that he had not sold Lauber fentanyl. He said what he sold her was OxyContin, a powerful opioid, yes, but a different drug entirely, one that in pill form would be significantly harder to administer fatally in a drink without detection. The defense argued that Lauber was an unreliable witness with her own legal troubles, that she had every incentive to cooperate with investigators and shade her testimony toward what they wanted to hear, and that the physical pills, the actual fentanyl, were never found in Kouri Richins' possession. These were not frivolous arguments. Lauber's credibility was legitimately complicated. She had drug court violations of her own. She had been told, investigators later acknowledged, that her cooperation could help her situation. The defense hammered on that point repeatedly throughout the trial. But the jury heard all of it. They heard Lauber's testimony, and they heard Crozier's contradiction, and they heard the defense's arguments about bias and pressure. And then they came back with a verdict in 3 hours. The life insurance policy on Eric Richins had been active for exactly 10 days. Valentine's Day 2022 fell on a Monday. It was a morning like any other in the Richins household in Camas, children getting ready for the day, the routines of a family with 3 young boys. Kouri had packed a sandwich for Eric, his favorite kind, by accounts given later. A thoughtful gesture. A loving wife, packing lunch for her husband on the most romantic day of the year. Eric took a single bite. Almost immediately, something was wrong. He broke out in hives. His body reacted with the violence of a severe allergic response, the kind that can kill a person within minutes if it goes untreated. He lost consciousness. He blacked out. What saved his life was, of all things, a medical device belonging to one of his sons, an EpiPen, kept in the house because one of the boys had a condition requiring it. Combined with Benadryl, the epinephrine counteracted the reaction. Eric survived, but he was shaken, deeply shaken, and he told people about it. He called his friend Josh Cross. Cross would later testify in court that Eric was somber during that call. Very serious. There was fear in his voice, not the fear of a man embarrassed by an allergic reaction, but the fear of a man who had looked at something and could not quite name what he was seeing, but knew it was dangerous. Eric told Cross what had happened. Cross listened. Eric also called his business partner, Kouri Wright. Wright would describe the same thing on the stand, a man who was not himself, a man whose voice carried weight that a simple allergic reaction would not explain. There was, however, another conversation. Allie Staking, who had been Kouri's friend since junior high school, testified that she heard about the Valentine's Day incident in a very different context. According to Staking, Eric recounted the episode to a group of friends in a tone that was almost humorous, framing it as an odd allergic reaction, something strange but not alarming. They had laughed about it. Even Eric, she said, had laughed about it. So 2 versions of Eric Richins' emotional state emerged from that day. One version, told to his closest male friends, showed a man who was frightened and could not explain why. Another version, told at a social gathering, showed a man who shrugged it off. What we cannot know, and will never know, is which version reflected what Eric actually believed. Did he suspect his wife? Did some part of him register the danger and choose not to name it, because naming it would have required him to confront something unbearable? Or did he genuinely write it off as a fluke? What we do know is that he went home. He slept in the same bed as Kouri. He accepted another drink from her hands 3 weeks later. And this time, there was no EpiPen that could help him. Prosecutors would later tell the jury that the Valentine's Day attempt was instructive in a specific way. Kouri had learned from it. A fentanyl-laced sandwich was not reliable enough. Eric could set it aside after one bite. He could survive it. Solid food was not the right delivery mechanism. A drink was different. A drink, once accepted and swallowed, goes down completely. You cannot spit out a drink after the fact. You cannot decide, halfway through, that you have had enough. If the drug is in the liquid, and the liquid goes down, the drug goes down with it. She had made a mistake on Valentine's Day. She corrected it on March 3rd. By all external accounts, the evening of March 3rd, 2022 was a celebration. Kouri Richins had closed on a property for her real estate business. A deal had come through. And so, as couples sometimes do when something goes right, they marked the occasion with a drink. Kouri made Eric a Moscow Mule vodka, ginger beer, lime, served in the copper mug that is traditional for the cocktail. She also made a lemon drop shot. And according to writings she had left in the family home, the two of them sat together in their bedroom in Kamas, Utah, and they drank to the deal. Then Kouri said she left to comfort one of their sons, who was having a nightmare. She went to the child's room, she said, and she stayed there. And when she returned to the bedroom some time later, she found Eric cold to the touch at the foot of their bed. She called 911 just after 3 in the morning on March 4th, 2022. Emergency responders arrived at the house in Kamesa, small mountain town about 40 miles southeast of Salt Lake City, tucked into the high country near Park City. They declared Eric Richins dead at the scene. He was 39 years old. Asleep in that same house, in their beds, were Carter, age 9, Ashton, age 7, Weston, age 5. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy would later testify to something that reframed the entire narrative of that night. Eric Richins had fentanyl in his system, not a trace amount, not an amount consistent with accidental exposure or recreational use. He had 5 times the lethal level of fentanyl in his blood. The drug had been ingested orally swallowed, not injected, not inhaled. And critically, the fentanyl was illicit. It was not pharmaceutical grade. It was not the kind of drug that appears in prescribed medication. It was street fentanyl, the kind that circulates through drug supply chains, and that no legitimate doctor had ever written a prescription for Eric Richins. 5 times the lethal dose. Swallowed. From a street source. The only drink he had consumed that night was the one his wife handed him. In the hours that followed Eric's death, Kouri Richins sent a text message to Robert Josh Grossman. It read, "No words. Turning phone off. Eric passed away last night." A few days later, she sent another. "They think an aneurysm." She told Grossman her husband had died of an aneurysm. She told her housekeeper Carmen Lauber the same thing, in almost identical language, when Lauber called and asked. Eric passed away from a brain aneurysm, not a fentanyl overdose. Not a medical event consistent with a powerful synthetic opioid shutting down a healthy man's respiratory system. An aneurysm. A natural-sounding death. The kind of thing that happens to people and leaves no obvious culprit. The only problem was that the medical examiner's office had a different answer. And investigators, when they arrived at the Richins' home and began asking questions, noticed very quickly that several things about Kouri's account did not add up. Detective Jeff O'Driscoll of the Summit County Sheriff's Office was assigned as the lead investigator in the death of Eric Richins. He was thorough. He was methodical. And within a short time of beginning his work, he had identified enough inconsistencies in Kouri Richins' account to justify a deeper look. The first inconsistency was about a phone. Kouri told investigators that on the night Eric died, she had left her cell phone charging in the bedroom while she went to comfort their son. She was not in the room, she said. She did not have access to her phone during that window. She was with her child. But the phone data told a different story. The records showed that during the time Kouri said she was in her son's room, the window during which Eric Richins was dying in the bedroom, her phone had been unlocked. Messages had been sent. And then those messages had been deleted. She had the phone. She was using it. She lied about where she was and what she was doing in the moments her husband died. When investigators searched the house, they found a second iPhone. It was in her bedside drawer, a phone she had not mentioned to anyone. Then there was the search history. When forensic examination of Kouri Richins' electronic devices was completed, work that involved FBI Special Agent Chaney Ng-To of the Intermountain West Regional Computer Forensics Laboratory, who extracted data from multiple phones, including Kouri's 2 iPhones and Robert Grossman's devices. Investigators found internet searches that a genuinely grieving widow would have no reason to conduct. She had searched for women Utah prison. She had searched for luxury prisons for the rich in America. She had searched for whether police could force someone to take a lie detector test. These searches did not occur after her arrest. They were not the panicked research of a woman who suddenly found herself accused of something she did not do. The timing of those searches placed them in a window that preceded any formal accusation. She was searching for information about prisons and polygraphs before investigators had publicly named her as a suspect. She also called the medical examiner's office. Personally, she picked up a phone and placed a call to the office conducting the autopsy on her husband's body, and she asked questions about his toxicology report. That call was recorded. It was later played for the jury in full. The April 2022 autopsy confirmed what the initial examination had suggested. The fentanyl in Kouri Richins' system was illicit and had been ingested orally. There was no pathway by which it could have arrived in his body accidentally. And there was something else. The autopsy found something that would become one of the more quietly damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. Among the substances detected in Kouri Richins' system, alongside the fentanyl that killed him, were medications that had been prescribed not to Eric, but to Kouri. His wife's prescription medications were in his body. The investigation continued to expand outward. Detective Frank Root collected phones from Robert Josh Grossman for forensic analysis. Every digital thread that connected Kouri Richins to the events surrounding her husband's death was pulled and examined. And the picture that emerged from all of that data was not the picture of a grieving widow. It was the picture of a woman who had spent months building toward this moment and then lied about almost every aspect of it when she was asked to explain herself. It took over a year, but by the spring of 2023, investigators were ready to make an arrest. There is something almost unbearable about the timing of Robert Josh Grossman's testimony. He appeared in the 3rd District Court in Park City, Utah, on March 4, 2026. That date was not chosen by accident or coincidence. March 4, 2026 was the 4th anniversary of the night Kouri Richins died, the night Kouri Richins made a drink, handed it to her husband, and then waited. Grossman took the stand and told the story of how he had come to be involved with this woman. He had first encountered her in South Carolina, where he answered an advertisement she had posted looking for help with a house flipping project. He was a handyman. He had skills. He went to work for her. Over time, as their professional relationship continued, and as Kouri's real estate work expanded and Grossman's involvement deepened, something shifted between them. By the time he moved to Utah in 2020, ostensibly to continue working on her properties, the relationship had become romantic. He testified about the texts. There were a lot of them, and they were displayed on the courtroom screens while Grossman sat in the witness box and watched. He put his head down at certain moments. He wiped his eyes. The experience of having a private correspondence laid out in front of a jury deciding whether the woman on the other end of those messages had murdered her husband, appeared to genuinely distress him. The texts were significant because they established, in Kouri's own words, the emotional logic of what followed. In the period leading up to Eric's death, she had sent Grossman a message that read, "If I was divorced right now and asked you to marry me tomorrow, you would?" Grossman replied yes. Weeks before Eric died, weeks before Valentine's Day, even she was already scripting the next act of her life, with Grossman cast in the lead role. The night before Eric died, Grossman had sent her a gif of 2 people kissing with the caption, "Love you." They were planning to get brunch together the following morning, March 4th, to celebrate the closing on her property deal. By the time that morning arrived, Kouri Richins was dead. About a month after Eric's death, a new text arrived from Kouri to Grossman. "I think I want you to be my husband one day." The relationship continued for several months afterward, but eventually it fell apart. Grossman testified that things changed after Eric died, that there were disagreements, and that Kouri ultimately ended things between them. Then he found out she had written a children's book about her dead husband. And then he found out she had been arrested for killing him. Grossman testified that after her arrest, he reached out to Eric's sister, Kouri Richins Benson, overwhelmed with guilt and sorrow. Specifically, he said, about his own wrongdoings connected to the infidelity. Katie's husband helped connect him with a private investigator who had been looking into Kouri as a suspect. That PI told Grossman directly that he believed Kouri was guilty. And that caused Grossman, by his own account, to re-examine everything, every conversation, every text, Every moment that had seemed ordinary at the time, but now looked different in hindsight. One particular conversation, he said, stood out. About 10 to 14 days after Eric's death, he and Kouri had gone out to the Uinta Mountains together. They talked about Eric. They talked about life and death and the supernatural. And then Kouri asked him something. She asked whether he had ever killed anyone during his military service in Iraq. She asked how it had made him feel. Grossman testified that at the time, he had not found this particularly strange. He was a veteran. Death was something he had encountered. The question could, on its surface, be read as the curiosity of a grieving person trying to understand mortality, trying to make sense of loss by reaching towards someone who had been close to it. That is how Grossman explained his reaction in the moment. But when you know what you know now, when you know that she had purchased fentanyl, that she had tried to poison him on Valentine's Day, that she put 5 times the lethal dose into his drink 3 weeks later, when you know all of that, the question she asked in the Uinta Mountains takes on a different meaning entirely. Released on March 5, 2023, almost precisely 1 year to the day after Kouri Richins died in his bed in Kamas, Utah, the children's book was called Are You With Me? It told the story of a young boy who had lost his father and was learning to look for signs of his continued presence in the ordinary moments of everyday life, in the world that remained after the person was gone. The father in the book was depicted with angel wings, watching over his son from somewhere beyond reach. Kouri Richins went on the radio to talk about it. She appeared on KPCW in Park City in April of 2023, and she said, in language that was warm and maternal and filled with the particular cadence of genuine grief, that writing the book had brought her a measure of peace. She said it had given her and her boys something to work toward during the first year without him. She talked about the holidays, and about Eric's birthday, and about the specific texture of grief that comes from trying to help children understand why their father was not coming home. She appeared on a local television program called Good Things Utah, a morning lifestyle show on KTVX, in that same period. She told the host she had written the book to help her children cope with the unexpected loss of their father. She was composed. She was articulate. She presented herself as a woman who had found, in the act of creating something, a way to process something unprocessable. The word unexpected. She used it deliberately, or at least comfortably. The unexpected death of their father. What investigators and prosecutors would later show the jury is that the book itself was, in several important respects, not what Kouri claimed it to be. Text messages recovered during the investigation revealed that Kouri had not written the book herself. A ghostwriter had produced it. Kouri had not sat with her children at night and shaped their conversations into prose. The creation of the book, the act she had described as a family healing process, a therapeutic journey shared between a mother and her grieving sons, had been outsourced. Whether the boys knew this, whether they had contributed anything to its creation, whether any of the bedtime conversations she described were real, none of that can be verified. What can be verified is that the text showed a ghostwriter had done the work, and Kouri had presented it as her own. Her mother, Lisa Darden, tried to help after the arrest. She sent a copy of the book to the Summit County Sheriff's Office, anonymously, with a handwritten note. The note said the book exemplified the true Kouri, a devoted wife and adoring mother. The book she hadn't written, about the husband she had killed. Less than a month after her television appearance on Good Things Utah, Kouri Richins was arrested. On May 8, 2023, more than 14 months after Kouri Richins died, Kouri Richins was placed under arrest. She was charged with aggravated murder and possession of a controlled substance. From the moment those handcuffs closed around her wrists, she has been held in the Summit County Jail without bail, and she has remained there through every subsequent court date, every hearing, every delay, every appeal, and finally through the trial itself. She has consistently, from the beginning, maintained her innocence. But even from inside a jail cell, Kouri Richins appears to have been trying to manage the narrative. 2 documents emerged during the period between her arrest and her trial that told investigators something about how her mind worked when she felt cornered. The first was known, at trial, as the Walk the Dog letter. Recovered in September of 2023, the letter appeared to have been written by Kouri to her family members, specifically to coach her mother, Lisa Darden, on what to say to Kouri's brother. The letter suggested that her brother should be guided toward a story about Eric. that Eric had confided in him about obtaining pain pills from Mexico, that Eric kept those pills hidden in an allergy pill bottle in his truck, that Eric's drug use was a secret he had shared only in private moments with trusted people. The letter, in other words, was an attempt to construct a posthumous narrative about Eric as a secret drug addict, a narrative that, if believed, would provide an innocent explanation for the fentanyl in his system. The second document was more explicit. Found in Kouri's jail cell, it ran to 6 pages. In it, she appeared to outline, in detail, what her mother and brother should say if they were questioned or called to testify. She instructed her brother to tell investigators and potentially a jury that Eric had confided in him about getting fentanyl from Mexico, and that Eric, in these private conversations, had described getting high every night. The implication was clear. Eric had been a secret opioid addict, and his overdose death was the result of his own hidden habit, not his wife's deliberate action. Defense attorneys, when this letter became part of the trial, described it as a fictional story Kouri had been working on. A creative exercise. Not instructions. Just writing. The jury, it appears, did not find this explanation persuasive. Meanwhile, more revelations were accumulating around the people closest to Kouri. An unsealed search warrant brought to light an investigation into her mother, Lisa Darden, that reached back to 2006. In April of that year, while Lisa Darden was living with a romantic partner, that partner died unexpectedly. The cause of death was drug poisoning and overdose of oxycodone. Lisa Darden had been the beneficiary of her partner's life insurance policy. Detective O'Driscoll wrote in the search warrant that based on Lisa Darden's proximity to her partner's suspicious overdose death and her close daily relationship with her daughter, it was possible she had been involved in planning and orchestrating Eric's death. It was never charged. The information did not come before the jury, but it sat there, in the public record, asking a question that nobody could quite answer. How much of what happened to Eric Richins was a solo operation, and how much of it was something that ran in the family? Kouri's legal troubles continued to expand during this period. In May of 2024, she was found guilty in a separate assault case, after failing to comply with the conditions of a plea agreement within the required time frame. Then, in June of 2025, the Summit County Attorney's Office filed an entirely new case against her 26 additional felony charges, including 5 counts of mortgage fraud, 5 counts of forgery, 7 counts of issuing a bad check, 7 counts of money laundering, 1 count of communications fraud, and 1 count of a pattern of unlawful activity. And in November of 2024, a juvenile court made a decision about the children. Carter, Ashton, and Weston, the 3 boys who had been asleep in the house the night their father died, were placed in the permanent custody of Eric Richins' family. They were no longer in the care of their mother's side. They were being raised by the family of the man she had killed. By the time Kouri Richins finally sat down in a courtroom to face a jury, she had been in jail for nearly 3 years. The road to that moment was not straight. It was filled with legal maneuvers, jurisdictional battles, appeals to the state's highest court, and delays that stretched the case across multiple calendar years. The case was overseen by 3rd District Court Judge Richard Mrazek. The chief prosecutor was Brad Bloodworth of the Summit County Attorney's Office. The defense team consisted of 3 attorneys, Wendy Lewis, Kathy Nestor, and Alex Ramos. On the prosecution's side, alongside Bloodworth, was a team of investigators and forensic specialists whose work had been years in the making. The most persistent legal fight before the trial itself concerned venue. Kouri's defense attorneys argued, repeatedly and with genuine legal force, that she could not receive a fair trial in Summit County. The case had received massive media attention. The community near Park City was small. Potential jurors had almost certainly been exposed to extensive coverage of the allegations. The defense wanted the trial moved to Salt Lake County, where the jury pool would be larger, more urban, more diverse in its exposure to the facts. Judge Mrazek denied the request. Twice. The Utah Supreme Court weighed in as well, ultimately declining in June of 2025 to grant the appeal on the venue question. The trial would stay in Summit County. The original trial date had been set for April of 2025. It was postponed while the Supreme Court considered the appeals. A new date was set. Jury selection would begin on February 10, 2026, with the trial itself starting on February 23, 2026, at the Summit County Courthouse in Park City, Utah. The final jury, 8 people who would decide the fate of Kouri Richins, was selected and sworn in. Judge Mrazek gave them careful instructions. They were not to research the case. They were not to read news coverage. They were not to discuss what they heard outside the courtroom walls. They were to come each day and listen. On February 23, 2026, Kouri Richins walked into that courtroom and the trial began. A few dozen people who wanted to watch the trial began lining up outside the courthouse in lawn chairs at 4 in the morning on the first day, 4.5 hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin. That is the level of public interest this case had generated. This was not a local story anymore. It was a national one. The prosecution's case was built across 13 days of testimony, with more than 40 witnesses taking the stand. Brad Bloodworth opened by telling the jury that the evidence would prove Kouri Richins had murdered Eric for his money and to get a fresh start at life. He said she had wanted to leave Eric but did not want to leave his money. He described her as intensely ambitious but incompetent, a woman who projected wealth and success while secretly drowning in debt. The witnesses came one by one, and each one added another piece to the picture. Eugene Richins, Eric's father, testified about the man his son had been, the values instilled in him, the quality of his character, the depth of his involvement in the lives of his children and grandchildren. A father testifying about a murdered son is one of the most quietly devastating things a courtroom can contain, and Mrazek's courtroom contained it on the first day. Katie Richins Benson, Eric's sister, testified about the family's anguish and about who her brother was to the people who loved him. She had been the one, after learning of the case, whose husband helped connect Robert Grossum to the private investigator who had been building a case against Kouri. She sat in that courtroom and watched the process her family had been pushing toward for years finally run its course. Cody Wright, Eric's business partner, talked about the fear in his friend's voice when Eric called him after the Valentine's Day incident. Allison Wright, Cody's wife, testified that Kouri had told her she feared what would happen if she and Eric divorced, that Eric would be financially secure and she would be left with nothing. Becky Lloyd offered perhaps the single most damaging 5 words of witness testimony in the entire trial. She told the jury that during a conversation, Kouri had basically said that it would be better if Eric were dead. Carmen Lauber returned to the stand and described the pill transactions in detail: the cash payments, the number of pills, the blue-green color of the fentanyl tablets. She described the phone call she made to Kouri after learning of Eric's death, during which she had asked Kouri directly whether those pills had been used on him. She said Kouri told her no, that Eric had died of a brain aneurysm, and that the pills were not involved. Lauber told the jury, that hit hard, only because if that was what had happened, she needed to step up and take accountability for her part in it. Robert Crozier, the drug dealer, took the stand for the defense, or at least, his testimony complicated the prosecution's narrative enough to be worth noting. He said that what he sold Lauber was OxyContin, not fentanyl. But his credibility had its own complications, and the jury was left to weigh his account against Lauber's and the physical evidence of what was actually found in Eric's body. Robert Josh Grossman sat in the witness box and confirmed the texts. He watched them appear on the courtroom screens and identified them as his own. He told the jury about the conversation in the Uinta Mountains when Kouri asked him about killing. He cried. He was visibly uncomfortable. He said he had never, for a single moment before her arrest, suspected that what had happened to Eric was intentional, least of all at her hands. Brooke Carrington, the forensic accountant, laid out the financial reality with clinical precision. Negative $1.6 million net worth. $4.5 million in total debt. Forged signatures on loan documents. A business that looked successful from outside and was a disaster from inside. Eric's life insured for more than $2.2 million. Policies taken out without his knowledge or genuine consent. Detective Jeff O'Driscoll testified at length about the walk the dog letter, about the jail cell letter, about the deleted texts, about the second hidden iPhone, about every digital thread he had followed for years. FBI agent Cheney Ng To testified about the technical forensic process by which that data had been extracted and verified. The defense had a clear strategy throughout: attack the investigation as sloppy and biased. They argued that O'Driscoll and his colleagues had decided from the beginning that Kouri was guilty and had pursued only evidence that confirmed that conclusion. They argued that the lead investigator had applied pressure on Laubert during her own legal difficulties to get her to cooperate, essentially promising her a get-out-of-jail-free card in exchange for testimony that connected Kouri to the fentanyl. They argued that there were alternative explanations, that Eric had Lyme disease, that he was dependent on painkillers, that the empty pill bottle found on his nightstand and the bags of marijuana gummies he used regularly painted a picture of a man whose relationship with substances was more complicated than prosecutors acknowledged. They even suggested, in one of the more startling moments of the trial, that Eric had been having a homosexual affair with his best friend. That texts recovered during the investigation pointed to an intimate relationship that Eric had concealed from his wife. The implication was presumably that Eric's life was more hidden and complicated than presented, and that this complexity might explain things that the prosecution attributed to Kouri. Then the defense rested, without calling a single witness. They had told the court they had witnesses ready. Those witnesses never took the stand. No one from Kouri's side testified in her defense. Kouri Richins herself declined to testify, as is her right. But the decision to rest without presenting any witness testimony after a prosecution case that had run 13 days and 40-plus witnesses was a notable moment. It told the jury that the defense did not feel it had anyone to put on the stand who would help more than hurt. Brad Bloodworth gave the closing argument for the prosecution. He told the jury that there was no other rational explanation for the evidence. He said Kouri Richins had doubled down and blamed Eric for everything, right up to the end, and that her behavior showed who she was, intensely ambitious. He asked the jury to see through her facade. He asked them not to let her get away with murder. The jury went out to deliberate. They had heard 3 weeks of testimony. They had processed more than 40 witnesses. They had seen the text messages and the search history and the financial records and the toxicology reports and the insurance policies. They had watched Carmen Laubert describe a cash transaction for fentanyl. They had watched Robert Josh Grossman cry as his text messages appeared on a screen. They had watched Kouri Richins sit at the defense table, wearing different outfits each day, taking notes on a legal pad. They deliberated for just under 3 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreperson handed the verdicts to the clerk, and Judge Richard Mrazek began reading. Guilty, 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 guilty. All 5 counts. Aggravated murder in the first degree. Attempted aggravated murder. 2 counts of insurance fraud. Forgery. Every single charge that had been filed against Kouri Richins in connection with the death of her husband came back with the same word. Kouri Richins was wearing a floral blouse. When the judge read the verdict, she lowered her head. Judge Mrazek read the jury's formal finding aloud. We, the jury, unanimously agree that the prosecution has proved the following circumstance beyond reasonable doubt: the homicide was committed for pecuniary gain, and the homicide was committed by means of the administration of any substance administered in any lethal amount, dosage, or quantity. For pecuniary gain. For money. That was the formal legal finding. That was what 12 people agreed had happened in the bedroom of a house in Kamas, Utah, on the night of March 3rd into the morning of March 4th, 2022. Outside the courthouse afterward, Eric's sister Amy Richins spoke to reporters. She said she was in shock. She said it had been a long time coming. She said she was very happy that they had gotten justice for her brother. A juror who later spoke publicly described watching Kouri during the trial and saying that she seemed kind of in her own world, as though the proceedings happening around her, the weight of the testimony, the magnitude of what was being decided, were somehow not fully landing on her in the way they might land on someone who understood the depth of what they had done. The following morning, March 17th, the Summit County Sheriff's Office released Kouri Richins' mug shot, the photograph taken at her arrest in May 2023. It was circulated by news outlets around the country. The image of a woman who had written a children's book about grief, who had gone on television to talk about helping her sons heal, who had described herself as a devoted wife and adoring mother, stared back from newspaper pages and phone screens. Their names are Carter, Ashton, and Weston. Carter is 13 now. Ashton is 11. Weston is 9. On the morning of March 4th, 2022, when their mother called 911 to say she had found their father cold in the bedroom, Carter was 9 years old. Ashton was 7. Weston was 5. They were asleep in their beds down the hall while their father lay dying. They woke up to a world that was irrevocably different from the one they had gone to sleep in, and they have been living in that different world ever since. Kouri Richins' obituary described him as an attentive and loving father who did absolutely everything in his power to provide his family with every possible opportunity to learn, grow, and have fun. Carter would have been old enough to carry specific, detailed memories of him of the coaching, the outdoor adventures, the way his father approached problems as challenges rather than obstacles. Weston was young enough that the clearest memories may already be slipping, replaced by stories other people tell and photographs other people keep. Ashton sits somewhere in the middle, old enough to remember, but young enough that the memories carry the particular fragility of early childhood. In November of 2024, a juvenile court ruled on the question of where the boys would live. They were placed in the custody of Kouri Richins' family, specifically with the people who had known and loved their father, the aunts and grandparents and family members who had spent years sitting in courtrooms demanding justice for the man he was. His sister, who had been named as trustee in his updated will and trust, was positioned to ensure the children's financial interests were protected in whatever way was still possible. Eric's sisters, Kouri Richins Benson and Amy Richins, along with his father, Gene Richins, have by all accounts made the boys their priority. They have kept the children's lives as private as it is possible to keep the lives of children at the center of one of the most covered true crime cases in years. They have tried to preserve what Eric built for his sons: the sports, the outdoor activities, the values he spent his life teaching them even in his absence. At Kouri's bail hearings, her attorney Catherine Nestor had stood in court and said, "As a mother, there is no way Kouri Richins is leaving her children no matter what they're being told. She would never leave her children." The argument was meant to demonstrate that Kouri would not flee, that she had too much to stay for. The boys are now being raised by the family of the man their mother killed. The defense attorney's words about motherhood hang in the air. The sentencing hearing for Kouri Richins is scheduled for 9:30 in the morning on Wednesday, May 13th, 2026. May 13th would have been Kouri Richins' 44th birthday. That date was not chosen to be cruel. Sentencing dates are set around court calendars and logistical availability, but the coincidence carries its own particular weight. On the day that Kouri Richins should have turned 44, the woman who ensured he never would stands before a judge to learn how many years of her own life she will spend inside a prison. She faces a minimum of 25 years in prison. The maximum is life without the possibility of parole. That is the range the judge will be working within when he imposes the sentence for the aggravated murder conviction alone, and the other 4 convictions carry their own additional penalties. The decision not to seek the death penalty was made deliberately and in consultation with Eric's father and sisters. Utah does allow capital punishment. The prosecutors had that option available to them. They chose not to use it. Legal experts who commented afterward suggested the reasons were practical, as well as personal. Securing a unanimous death penalty verdict is extraordinarily difficult, and the family may have simply wanted a conviction they could count on rather than a higher stakes outcome that carried more risk. After sentencing, Kouri Richins' legal team is expected to file an appeal. This is standard in cases of this magnitude, and it was anticipated from the beginning. The appeal could raise a range of legal questions: the venue decision, the admissibility of certain evidence, the conduct of the investigation, the pressure applied to Carmen Lauber. An appeal of this kind can take months to prepare and years to work through the court system. It does not mean she leaves prison. It means the legal process continues while she remains incarcerated. What she will not be getting back is the 26-count financial fraud case that the Summit County Attorney's Office filed against her separately in June of 2025. That case, covering 5 counts of mortgage fraud, 5 counts of forgery, 7 counts of issuing a bad check, 7 counts of money laundering, 1 count of communications fraud, and 1 count of a pattern of unlawful activity, is still pending and will proceed on its own timeline. The murder conviction does not resolve those charges. It merely adds to the portrait of a woman whose relationship with fraud and deception extended far beyond the act of poisoning her husband. Kouri Richins' family could, in theory, pursue civil action or seek restitution through the criminal case. But legal experts who commented on the situation were clear-eyed about the reality. Kouri Richins has no assets. Her real estate business was a financial disaster. Whatever she owned, she owed more. The life insurance policies that she had taken out on Eric, the policies that were the stated motive for his murder, were never paid out to her. She has been in jail since May of 2023. She is going to prison, perhaps for the rest of her life. The prospect of recovering money from a woman who is going to spend the foreseeable future earning, as one attorney put it, possibly 10 cents an hour, is not realistic. On March 20th, 2026, 4 days after the verdict, ABC's news magazine program aired a special edition devoted to the case. It was called Murder, She Wrote, the Kouri Richins trial. The program featured an exclusive interview with Ollie Staking, the childhood friend who had testified at trial and had known Kouri since junior high school. It also included interviews with the jury foreperson and members of Kouri's family. The case had become the kind of story that lives beyond the courtroom, that enters the broader cultural conversation about what marriage means, what desperation looks like, and how far a person can travel from the person they wanted to be. We will keep you in loop of what happens next. But what's your take on this case? Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment.